Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the 2022 Infinite Dial Canada report. I'm Nicole Beniamini, Vice President here at Edison Research, and I am joined by my lovely co-host, Stephanie Donovan, who is the Global Head of Revenue over at Triton Digital. Stephanie,
Hi, Nicole.
say hello.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you again. We always enjoy this partnership and look forward to a really impactful, but also surprising results this year.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to be here today because I've been managing the Infinite Dial Canada report since it debuted in 2018. In fact, I actually manage all of the Infinite Dial studies that Edison does. So, typically though, I'm behind the scenes. I'm writing the questionnaire and managing the operations, putting together the presentation. So I'm really happy to be here today with you, Stephanie, as we present the findings from this year's report. But before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, we're always asked about the presentation deck and the recording of the webinar. Both will be available on our website, edisonresearch.com, shortly after the presentation today. So you can look for it later this afternoon. Second, if you plan on sharing or tweeting any of the data or slides that you'll see here, just make sure to use the hashtag #InfiniteDial. Third, if you have any questions, just pop them into the Q&A box below. We have a staff that is waiting to read and answer your questions as they come in. If you don't have any questions, but you want to introduce yourself to your fellow attendees, you can say hello to everyone in the chat box. Just keep in mind that we are not monitoring the chat box for questions. So if there's something you want to ask us, please make sure you put it in the Q&A box below. Okay, so now we can begin. Just going to turn off our cameras now, Stephanie. I don't think they care more about the slides than us. Okay. All right, so moving on. For those of you who are new to the Infinite Dial series, it was first conducted in the US back in 1998, and it's currently the longest running survey of digital media consumer behavior in the US. And now over the last few years, we've expanded the study to other countries, such as Australia, which you may have caught earlier this week, South Africa, the UK, of course, Canada. But here's some inside information. We will be announcing a new Infinite Dial report in the next few weeks, so stay tuned and keep a lookout for that. But using the same survey tool in all of these markets allows us to compare their adoption and usage of all sorts of stuff, online audio, device ownership, podcasting, among other things. So we'll see some of those comparisons as we go through today's findings. Just a quick review of how the study was conducted. In March and April of this year, we did a national telephone survey of 1,014 Canadians age 18 and older, so the adult population. We applied the gold standard in research by using RDD sampling for both landline and mobile phones. In order to represent the Canadian population, we offered the survey in both English and French. And we had about 20% of respondents who took the survey in French. We then weighted the data to reflect the Canadian 18+ population statistics. So we'll begin with a quick look at the current state of media and technology in Canada. This year, approximately 88% of Canadians age 18+ report owning a smartphone. It's technically a tick up from last year, but we would call this statistically flat. And we've seen this plateauing of smartphone ownership in other Infinite Dial reports as well. It just means now that pretty much everyone who is going to own a smartphone already does. We also see that tablet ownership, that's remaining relatively stable as well. So it's at 51% this year. It's a little bit down from 2021's numbers, but considering how the pandemic and the remote learning may have increased the need for tablets, it's not surprising to see ownership come down as life is beginning to return to normal. We are reporting some growth, however, among those who own a smart speaker. This year, 30% of Canadians age 18 plus say they have at least one smart speaker device in their household. This is a 10% increase from the last year, and that last year's number was pretty much flat after it experienced a big jump in 2019. So this is the first year that we're really seeing some growth happening. And I alluded to it earlier before, but when we get to do the same survey in multiple markets, we get to show data like this, which is a graph comparing smart speaker ownership in 2022 among the US, Australia, and Canada. So if you're familiar with the US and Australia reports, just be mindful of the fact that these specific percentages are among the 18 plus population, not the 12 plus numbers we reported in their respective webinars. But here you can see that ownership is highest in the US. And this makes sense since it was the first of these three countries where a smart speaker, the Amazon Alexa, was available. That was back in 2015. And it took nearly 2 years for the first smart speaker, which was the Google Home, now the Nest, to arrive in Canada and Australia. And Canada actually had both versions, the Google Home and the Alexa, show up in 2017, but it did take a little bit longer for Australia to have Amazon arrive. So that is likely why Australia has the lowest ownership of the three. But not only is ownership of these devices growing, but so is the number of devices owned. And this year, more than half of the Canadian smart speaker owners have more than one device. And it actually averages to about 2 devices per household. And you're gonna see that this is up from the mean of 1.8 in 2021. So I'm a mother of 2 young kids. I know from my own personal experience that once you realize how useful these little devices are, you end up putting them in every room of your house. We use it to dance in the kitchen, check the weather in the morning, and check this out. Alexa, who is right?
Mommy. Mommy is always right.
Yeah, that's for my husband as well, Stephanie. So I don't know if you want to train yours to do the same, but
I love that. I'm going to have to definitely train that. I mean, we'll get a good laugh if nothing else.
So Stephanie, while you're on, actually, a question that may be on everyone's mind is, how has this increased ownership of these devices changed how Canadians are listening to online audio?
Well, it's definitely interesting because looking at 2022, now more than half of the respondents are listening to online audio in the home. And I think it's a bold sign for for just audio in general, its growth, because now the distribution points are so much larger than they were before. So I think it's a great sign. But
Great.
with that,
you can walk us through now the online audio section while I have you
absolutely,
on.
absolutely. So thanks so much. And I think in general, online audio is hot, and audio in general is smoking, but it's online audio that's at the center of the energy and engagement among listeners and advertisers. Let's take a look at specifically listening to AM/FM radio online in the last month. Fully 1/4 of Canadian adults listened to AM/FM online last month. That's a 4% jump. That's actually after a very stable 2018 to 2021, a 4% jump. I think that's remarkable. And we see that habitual listening continuing. Here, we see a 6% jump to 20%. A full 1 in 5 Canadian adults listened to online to AM/FM radio last week. Now, if we take that picture and zoom out from AM/FM to any online audio listening, we see nearly 3 out of 4 Canadians surveyed responded that they listened to online audio in the last month. Nicole, that goes back to that growth we're seeing from multiple distribution points, smart speakers included. It's been a steady increase during COVID from 2020 to 2021, And we see a slight lift up to 73% in this last report. And that 73% is on par with the US. You know, Nicole, I've been pleased to be with Edison in these presentations really for the last 3 or 4 years. And I have to say, this is the first time I recall Canada being on par with the US for online audio listening. So it's a tremendous story. And for context, you referenced the infinite dials a couple of months ago with US, even the infinite dial that was presented earlier this week. And so these numbers, some of you, these numbers are relevant, but I would just caution as someone that if you did go back like me, because Australia was very late in the evening, go back and look at listen to the recording, then you'll see that these percentages are slightly off. So to note, we did an apples to apples comparison showing 18 plus in these numbers. When you go back to the earlier presentations, numbers will be slightly different because the age was a bit different. Just a quick note.
Yeah, actually, Stephanie, that's going to be the same throughout. Anytime we show the country comparisons, it'll be among the 18 plus, the adult population for all of the markets, but good point.
So we saw monthly online listening increase. If we take a look then at weekly online audio, again, to any brand last week, we saw an increase to slightly up from last year, which is fantastic. So if we want to push this a little further, I don't think we're at that plateau yet. So maybe we need to hear that BTS is coming together again, if that's your jam, or if your jam is Justin Bieber or Drake, maybe they could drop a new album. But anyway, online audio is definitely increasing. And as shown, online audio is growing, but let's look at what respondents are saying as is their top brands for the content. So when we look at just awareness, what brands are respondents saying are most brand aware for them? The top 10 brands is led by Spotify, dominantly. It's actually YouTube Music that caught my attention here, because YouTube Music is the audio platform from Google in that second position. Last year, Nicole, that was Apple. And now you see that in the fourth position, inched out just barely for number 3 at Amazon Music. So we also see CBC and Stingray entering the top 10 of brand awareness. That's a tremendous for the Canadian story. This, along with Radio Player Canada, pushed TuneIn, we see in the number 10 slot, but yet that's still up 3% from last year. Just a quick editing note. YouTube Music is the former Google Music. So switching from awareness to actual consumption, we see that Spotify again shows as the number 1 online audio brand at 40%. That is up 10% from last year. YouTube Music more than doubled, up now 1 in 4. YouTube Music is up to 33%. And again, we see that the list of Canadian infusion here is strong. We see CBC, iHeart Music. Those are pretty stable from last year. And we also see Radio Player Canada and TuneIn rounding out the top 10. And when we talk about brands used most often, we see that Spotify tops it at 42% again. But YouTube Music is the one that has doubled from last year. This is the one I was referring to that is 1 in 4, saying that it is the brand that they use most often. I will point to Apple Music. While it is still dominant, I think its loyalty in this survey has waned a bit, dropping more than half. It's down 9% to 6%. CBC also saw a drop from its stable 9% in previous studies. In this report, it's showing at 5%. I wanted to take a moment. I love this chart, Nicole. I'm so glad that Edison included it, because if we take the former chart of 42% for Spotify, And then we apply the logic and the report from smart speaker growth that you spoke about a few minutes ago. It's really interesting to see the impact of smart speaker owners and their dominant brands that they choose. Because Spotify being pervasive across smart speaker ownership, it really justifies why smart speaker owners, more than half, listen to Spotify. And that could be that Amazon just this year took over Google Home for the top ownership of top buyer of smart speakers in Canada. It's the first time. And then Apple, now one of the other rationales that could be, and we'll wait to see for the next report when that comes out, but Apple just became available on Google Home in Canada in December. So as that matures and gets marketplace, maybe that'll shift next year. So we've looked at who's listening and what content that they're listening to, but where they're listening. So let's dive deeper into in-car audio. It's clear from this that driving, commuting, and a little road rage may be back. The respondents here, 18 plus, show that they have either ridden or driven a car in the last month has grown. We're not quite back at the pre-pandemic levels though. That may be because we still have office spaces and using work from home flexibility, still some of the lingering COVID or COVID variant related cases. I think, Nicole, we'll have to see in the next reports if that returns or if this is really the new normal when it comes from a commuting perspective. I will say this actually matches the infinite dial report trajectory that was shown in the US earlier this year.
Yeah, and Stephanie, it's also interesting too, because the 2020 number is the number that really stands out. But I do think a lot of that in-car behavior has returned to, if you look at 2019 and 2018, it does fall in line with that. So I do think we are back on the roads almost the way we were before the pandemic.
So if we take that number, which was very strong, and break it down into the different age cells, we see if we add the second age cell and the third, that driving or riding is still dominated by anyone over 35 based on these respondents. However, I always look at the contrarian view and say that it's interesting to see the biggest jump, and that came in the 18 to 34 age segment. It increased 13%. So it's interesting to see and something definitely to watch. And of all those car riders, what are they listening to? AM FM. AM FM still is the dominant content listened to in the car at 70%. Now, we do see that AM FM shifted down 9% from last year. I was also surprised to see that CDs increased.
Well, I wonder if it's also the people who are in the car. What has changed for them? The type of people who were driving. I bet that number from last year shows that there were fewer older people driving in the car. So that number is coming back as maybe the older population is returning on the roads. Stephanie, did we lose you? Okay, while we wait for Stephanie, I can carry on with this. So this next slide is showing ownership of the in-dash information and entertainment systems in the car. And again, this is among the 18 plus population who has been driving or riding in a vehicle in the last month. So we see here that now we are at 26%, so fully 1 in 4 now own this type of in-dash system in their car. and that is actually up 2% from last year. So, as we see more of these systems in people's vehicles, we will start to see, an increase in listening to online audio, podcasts, anything that would require internet access. So actually, it brings us right to the podcast section, which I will go over. That was part of the plan anyway, so that all works out. But if you had caught our Infinite Dial US study back in March, you would have learned how the pandemic is still affecting podcast listening in the US. We do see some differences, however, when we jump over to Canada. And if you caught the Infinite Dial Australia earlier this week, you would have had a sneak peek of that as well in terms of what differences we might be seeing. So starting with overall awareness, today 77% of Canadians age 18 and older are at least familiar with the term podcast, even if they've never listened to one. And you can see here that this number is essentially unchanged from last year's number. We also saw this same flatness in both the US and Australia this year. And this graph shows that awareness in all three markets. If you looked back at 2021's report, this graph looks exactly the same. So awareness of the medium didn't really change much in any of these countries. Again, these percentages are the 18 plus populations, so might look different in what was reported in US and Australia. We also see the percentage of those who have ever listened to a podcast remain stable this year as well. If you recall, we reported a big jump in 2021 when we went from 50% in 2020 to 57% in 2021. So this was that was a big jump that we saw, and it's not hard to suppose that the pandemic restrictions that happened in 2020 through early 2021 were really the perfect breeding ground for new listening. People suddenly had time and motivation to try something new. And we saw that reflected in 2021's numbers. However, 2022, it looks like life is returning to normal, and those who were already inclined to trying a podcast may have already done so. Now, I hinted about seeing some differences from the US, and we find them here in terms of monthly podcast listening. This year, 43% of Canadians age 18 plus said they listened to a podcast in the month before we contacted them. And this is up quite a few percentage points from last year, from the 38% in 2021. So this is fantastic news for the podcast industry in Canada. It looks like all the listeners we gained in 2021, they tried it, they liked it, and they became monthly listeners in 2022. In fact, this increase has shifted the leaderboard around a bit and puts Canada with the highest percentage of monthly podcast listeners compared to Australia at 40%, and the US, whose 38% is actually down a little bit from last year. So we will see what this slide looks like next year once life starts to settle down even more, hopefully, and we'll see if the US starts to climb back up in terms of monthly podcast listening. So now that we have this group of monthly podcast listeners in Canada, we're going to just take a look at how the demographics compare to the rest of the Canadian adult population. We have the Canadian total population on the left and the monthly podcast listeners on the right. Similar to what we see in the US, monthly podcast listeners are still, they're more male than female, and they're more male than the Canadian population is. We also see bigger differences. We do see bigger differences, however, when we look at the age composition. So monthly podcast listeners are much younger than the overall adult population in Canada. Nearly half, 45%, are between the ages of 18 and 34. and most of them are under the age of 55. So you see that yellow slice on the right, that represents the 18% of monthly podcast listeners who are 55 and older, and they are very much underrepresented. Moving on to weekly podcast listening, we find that today, more than 1/4 of Canadian adults, 26%, have listened to a podcast in the last week. And this is the same 13% increase year over year that we saw in monthly podcast listening. So it's further evidence that not only have Canadians tried listening to podcasts, but they become now regular listeners. We asked our weekly podcast listeners to tell us the number of podcast episodes. So not shows or series. And we're pretty clear about that in our question wording. But how many episodes did they listen to in the week before we contacted them? And they reported listening to quite a few episodes, averaging about 5 episodes in the last week. Just a quick note, this is slightly different from the wording we showed last year, so we can't really compare that. This year, we're asking about specific episodes. If you look at the bottom of the pie chart and you compare that maroon slice showing those who said 6 to 10 with the green slice showing those who said 11 or more, we can see that about 20% of weekly podcast listeners in Canada are listening to 6 or more episodes per week. Other research we've conducted has shown that this specific group of podcast listeners are more engaged with the medium more than anyone else. Stephanie, have you been able to rejoin us?
I've reconnected.
Okay, good. Welcome back. I was actually, oh, no problem. This is what happens when you do it live sometimes, things happen. But I was going to ask you, Stephanie, do you have any insights that you're willing to share from the Triton Canada podcast ranker?
Yes. So what we see is there's certainly diversity in what people are listening to. And this mirrors very much about what we see in the podcast metrics platform. And I think what's interesting is to see how many are sampling at least 2 episodes. And so we see that there's a lot more growth in terms of people using more time with podcasting, as well as searching around and finding more episodes to listen to. So this slide is very encouraging.
Great. Well, we have more podcast data to share. So, but we're actually going to zoom back out now to our monthly podcast consumers. So back to those who said they listened in the last month. And we asked them about their listening in different locations, and at home remains the clear leader on this board. 88% of these monthly podcast listeners listen to podcasts in their own home, followed by work with about 1/3 saying they listen there. And then you see that, it's followed by in the car or truck at 30%, while walking around or on foot, 28%. And that's my location of choice. I do laps around the block while listening to my podcasts. And then while riding public transportation and at a gym or while working out, come in at 19%. When asked about listening to Canadian produced podcasts, so do you currently listen to podcasts that you know are produced in Canada? 56%, so more than half of monthly podcast listeners say they currently do so. Now, again, keep in mind, there are people who don't know where their shows are produced. There are people who think it's Canadian and it's not. There are people who don't think it's Canadian, but it is. So, these are people who said yes to this question. And finally, we asked monthly podcast listeners to think about how much of a podcast episode they typically listen to. If you look at that teal green slice, 47%, so nearly half of monthly podcast listeners say they listen to the entire episode. And you add that to the blue slice, the 44% who say they listen to most of the episode, you have 91%. So nearly all monthly podcast listeners are engaged and are listening for most, if not all, of the episode. So this is great news for the podcast industry and its advertisers. So that wraps up the podcasting section and the data that we have for you today. I'll turn my camera back on and we can share some observations. Stephanie, you can begin.
Yeah, so I found three striking things. Nearly 3/4 of Canadians listen to online audio on a monthly basis, which, as we pointed out, puts us right in line with the US and slightly behind Australia. All three countries grew in the last year, which I think is a fantastic story for online audio in general. Also, a compelling story for Canadians with CBC and Stingray coming and making a dominant appearance in both brand awareness and usage in this report. I'm really excited to see how these continue to evolve. I think online audio in general will lift, but as these take a more dominant position with amongst some of the big three, it's interesting to see their growth as well as how their content is making an impact on Canadians. And my other one, and you had some as well, is YouTube Music. Again, formerly known as Google Music, grew as an online audio brand, which is significant. And we saw Spotify remain in that top position. But it's interesting to see for various reasons how YouTube Music continues to make waves in the online audio space. And I think year over year, Nicole, this is going to be one to watch and see the variations between those top brands and how they fight for position.
Yeah, definitely. We'll see how this chart looks next year. So thanks, Stephanie. I'll take over some of my observations here. We did see a nice increase in smart speaker ownership in 2022. So now 30% of Canadians 18 plus say they have at least one of these fun and helpful devices in the household, which maybe help increase the online audio listening that we saw.
And unlike children, they're trainable to say that you are right. Key finding of this.
Still working on my kids. I'm still working on them. And then now, as we saw before, as Canadians upgrade their vehicles, they are also increasing their audio options in the car with, 1/4 of Canadians 18 plus who ride in cars have an in-dash entertainment system in their main vehicle, which again, I pointed out before that these new devices are now helping online audio and even satellite radio increase and grow in the car. And lastly, podcast listening has reached a new height this year, both monthly and weekly. 43% of Canadian adults say they've listened in the last month, and 26% listened in the last week. And I think that it's great to see that all of these new listeners that tried it when they were also probably learning how to bake and garden, they've stuck with it and they've done it. Now, I don't know how their gardens look now that we're returning to normal, but mine does not look that great. So
there's probably a podcast. There's probably a podcast to correct that as well. But you're right. We see this. Triton recently released the podcast metrics ranker in the market, and the next one is coming out in the next week or so. And we see another trend up. So Edison Research always does a fantastic job. Nicole, thank you so much for allowing Triton to participate with you. What we see when we measure the market, specifically for podcasting or even live streaming, are the same trajectories that you show here. So it's a great opportunity for online audio. It's a great opportunity for Canadians to consume content in a way that's friendly to them wherever they are.
Yeah, and I love doing all these different countries because it really gives us a chance to see how just how they all listen differently. They all have reasons for listening, different reasons for listening. So I love that we get to track not only within Canada, but among different countries as well. So that's it, everyone. We hope we found today's webinar useful and informative. Just as I mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we will have this deck along with the recording available on our websites later today. We will also have this deck available in French in the next few days as well. So we're going to leave the chat and Q&A boxes open for just a few more minutes. If you did not get your question answered, you can, or you run out of time, you can, or you think about it tonight as you are eating dinner, you can just email us at info@edisonresearch.com, and we'll get back to you on that. On behalf of Edison Research and Triton Digital, we thank you all for joining us today. And we also want to thank, or I want to thank, the incredible teams at both companies who make this study not only possible, but fun. So thank you again for attending the Infinite Dial Canada webinar, and have a great day.
Thanks, Nicole.
Bye, Stephanie.